Hi, I'm Elle Griffin, editor of Utah Business Magazine, and I am here with a wonderful group of people who are going to talk with us about what it's like to hire and recruit young talent. We're doing this as part of a webinar series in anticipation of our upcoming Living Color Gala. It's a black tie event we'll be hosting on October 1st to recognize and honor those who have made it their mission to attract and really focus on diversity and inclusion efforts in the state of Utah. Soledad O'Brien is going to be our keynote speaker, and it's going to be a really fun time. That's on October 1st. So make sure to check that out at utahbusiness.com/livingcolor. And now I'm going to hand us over to young professionals at Salt Lake City, YPSLC. Brandy Mull is our executive director. And welcome.
Hi, thank you. I'd like to thank you and Utah Business Magazine for the opportunity to discuss here today. Thank you all for attending. I am here with Becky Frost, founder and CEO of Frost Communications, Neelam Chand, Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Zions, and Shannon Collaer, the Director of Talent at Clearlink. And we are so excited to discuss hiring young talent today. Would you all like to further introduce yourselves? We can start with Shannon.
Sure, thanks so much, Brandy. As Brandy touched on, my name is Shannon Collaer. I serve as Director of Talent at Clearlink. I also oversee all of our diversity and inclusion commitments as an organization. I've been at Clearlink in Utah for about 3 years now, and prior to moving to Salt Lake City, I lived and worked in Washington, D.C. At a boutique recruiting firm, and also earned my undergraduate degree there. I moved to Utah for the incredible employment and technology opportunity in terms of industry as well as outdoor access, and I'm excited to be talking today about the overlap between young talent expectations and diversity and inclusion, because I see that a ton in candidates and expectations that I talk with. So that's a little bit about me.
Becky?
Sure thing. I'm Becky Frost. My pronouns are she, her, and I, similar to Shannon, moved here to head up public relations and communications at one of our many tech organizations here in Utah. And I had the opportunity at that company to lead our Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Council. I've been in the communications field for more than 15 years, and I've been lucky enough at both private and public companies to head up employee resource groups and diversity and inclusion committees and councils, and working side by side with people and with companies to help them move diversity forward. So I'm also very, very happy to be here today. Thanks.
Thank you. And Neelam?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm excited. So I'm Neelam Chand, and I am the Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Zions Bank. I've been there for about a year, and I've been doing diversity and inclusion for about 12 years. Prior to Zions Bank, I was a marketing and communications director for the University of Utah for diversity and inclusion. And so it's an interesting topic when we talk about talent development and seeking out talent from different generations. I'm coming from a University of Utah where there's a lot of young talent being developed, and now I'm also working for a very older organization. And so bridging the two has been something that has still been a conversation. I don't think it's been perfected, even in younger organizations. So I love that we're having this conversation, and hopefully it's useful to all of those who are looking for jobs or who are trying to skill up.
Awesome. As Neelam mentioned, it's a very interesting topic because there's tons of transplants flocking to Salt Lake City and Utah as a whole. I'm one of those transplants. I'm originally from Delaware. In addition, there are tons of local talent from the U and other local universities. So it's great to talk about what these applicants are looking for when accepting and deciding to stay in these positions and how this affects the companies hiring them. So I'd like to start out with the basics. Could we begin by discussing why hiring young talent is important to companies? We can start with Becky.
Sure, and thank you. Of course, when we're thinking about hiring young talent, it's often that catch-22. I remember starting out in my career where experience was required, but I needed the job to get the experience. And luckily, there are a lot of organizations that offer wonderful internships and entry-level positions here. There's a lot of opportunity here in Utah. And another reason why it's important, not just bringing in your talent pipeline or expanding your talent pipeline, but for companies, it's really more reflective of your customer base. This is the first time and as long as it's been tracked, that we have 5 generations in the workforce. And to me, that's a good thing because we have so many different approaches to how we solve problems.
Excellent. Shannon?
Yeah, I would agree that it's a matter of reflecting both your customer base and who's in your general workforce. Utah is the youngest state in terms of average age in the United States. So if we are, if we are reflecting the population of our location, we need to be having young talent. And there is so much opportunity to knowledge share between generations to equip organizations to have long-term success by bridging the knowledge of the older generations in the workforce to continue success for the future of those organizations and industries.
Excellent. Neelam?
Yeah, so just piggybacking off of what Becky and Shannon already said, millennials right now in Utah, 1 out of every 4 person Utahn is a millennial. So we are representing, and like Shannon had mentioned, we are one of the largest millennial population in the nation. That's a huge thing. Baby in the background, by the way, he wants to be a part of the conversation. So that's interesting. And then in 5 years, our population, our workforce population is going to be about 70% millennials and Gen Zs. So if just that alone, it's important for us to really think about hiring young talent and making sure that we're making sort of these very targeted approaches to make sure that we're engaging our young audience. But also on the flip side, when we think about brands and when we think about our clients, the future of our clients and brands, those are our young folks. Those are our millennials and Gen Z population. So we have to figure out what they care about in order to build our brand and keep relevant. And I have a few statistics on that, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I just think for those 2 reasons, sheer fact that we've got a huge population, but also it's important to our clients and our consumers. Those 2 reasons are good reasons enough to make sure that we're thinking about that.
Excellent. Becky mentioned that we're having multiple generations in the workforce. Are companies doing anything special to specifically target or market positions to young applicants? Becky, if you'd like to start, that's fine.
Sure. You know, as someone who's built and grown teams of young professionals, particularly in the communications space, I know that when we were targeting and recruiting people who were earlier in their careers, we really worked to make sure we had great relationships with universities, but also making sure that we had great relationships with, especially when we're thinking of diversity with here in Utah, Latinos in Action, which helps young Latino students build and plan their careers and college paths. Working with our chambers of commerce, working with the student organizations at universities as well as at other places in a community really helped. But it's also, how are we attracting them? One of the clients I work for, Bridge, they make learning and development software and career planning software. They actually did a study 2 years ago, and the millennial generation and Gen Z gets a lot of things put on them that aren't the case, right? Like, oh, they're job flippers, they're this, they're that, they're the other. A lot of assumptions about those generations aren't true. And actually research shows that if you, not only for attracting, but to retain that talent, you have to help them see a career path. So if we remain engaged and say, this is the type of company, not just where you'll get your foot in the door, but where you can have a meaningful career that aligns with your purpose, they're more likely to stay and are some of the most loyal employees you can have.
Awesome. Shannon?
Yeah, I think that point that Becky made in terms of really investing in this population is what can make or break your ability to not only attract but genuinely retain millennial and Gen Z talent. It is definitely a younger group that is aware that they have, skills gaps or knowledge gaps, and they want to be invested in and have people and managers especially who say that they're worth putting time and kind of training into. So in terms of my team, at Clearlink, I manage 2 teams on the corporate and sales side of our business. The number one thing that we talk about in one-on-ones, and the number one thing I ask that I see in feedback from them is, I want more development. I want to learn more skills. I want to level up and figure out what my place is here, but I am not attached to necessarily a title or a department. I just want to do more and have a larger impact. So understanding that flexibility and investing in the potential is the biggest difference maker that I've seen for genuinely engaging and retaining that millennial and Gen Z talent.
Excellent. Neelam?
Yeah, I mean, all of those things. I would say that when we think about millennials and what they value, millennials value flexibility just as much as Gen Zs. And they value the opportunity to have a work-life balance. And so for companies knowing these pieces of what our young folks value and adjusting to those values and making sure they reflect and align with those values, will have a better chance of recruiting young talent. And then Gen Zs, they went through the 2008 recession. And so job security is a big deal. They've seen their families go through the recession. And so for them, flexibility is important too, but also just sustainability, as Shannon mentioned, to make sure that there's a robust succession plan and an investment in employee development. Those are big things to retain and recruit and retain that talent. So I believe companies are really focusing on what young folks are valuing and then adjusting the way they've done business to make sure that they align with those values.
I'm hearing a lot about flexibility. So in your experience, are young professionals not really valuing traditional benefits like healthcare, 401k, dental, things like that, and more so, perks like the flexibility, flex time, PTO? Becky, we can start with you.
I think that having a standard approach to what you offer, healthcare is something that every single person that I've ever interviewed and hired, that's been table stakes, as well as having a good 401k. You can value flexibility while at the same time expecting your employer to bring certain things to the table. And so it's not that, hey, give me work-life balance and I will let go of basic things that most organizations offer at a job. It's, I will be flexible, I will bring my A game, but I still have these expectations. And we're actually seeing a little bit of a pushback, whereas about 5 years ago, we started to see unlimited paid time off as something to recruit and draw in young talent. And what a lot of people, and this is somewhat of a contrarian view, but unlimited paid time off, when studies show that we don't tend to use that or take unlimited vacations, you actually take less if it's not defined. And then when you leave that job, you have no paid time off that the company then owes you money for. So we're starting to see companies actually start to offer defined paid time off again, so that when you do, if you change jobs, if they owe you money for that time off you didn't take, that's something that you can bring with you. So again, it's hard to make generalizations, but I do believe in my hiring experiences, and certainly when I was starting out, just because I wanted flexibility and just because I wanted to be working on multiple projects didn't mean that I didn't expect to have those standard offerings.
Okay. Shannon?
I would agree that traditional benefits are more of a baseline expectation now, and then it's about, but what else are you doing? And playing with the definitions. So we say healthcare, but there's an increasing question around, okay, what does your healthcare do for my mental health? What's my therapy coverage? What kind of options do I have for a more holistic sense of wellness versus just medical, vision, dental? So I think it's really an evolving view of what those benefit expectations are. Similarly, you have a 401k, but do you have any financial knowledge? Do you have any way for folks to be understanding how to use their 401k or the smart way to go about a mortgage? And we see our workforce at Clearlink expecting that. They want to be taught how to use those benefits intelligently. We have info sessions on why an HSA might be right for you or a traditional PPO plan. So I think there's just an evolving expectation. And then similar to Becky's point around, I think some of the flashy perks that had kind of dominated the conversation, I think we're definitely seeing a shift away from that. I think unlimited paid time off, or the classic, like, but we have ping pong, these kind of surface level things that don't actually add value for people's lives. I think we're getting a lot pickier about the substance of perks and benefits versus maybe the more like catchy ideas.
Exactly, like free food or a cool cafeteria or scooters in the hallway, if you're not helping me manage my mental health, means nothing.
Okay. Neelam?
Yeah, I think for, it goes back to the values again. What do millennials and Gen Zs value? And people in general, what do they value? You know, if folks are trying to start families, what does that look like? How does the company that you work for support that? Beyond just regular maternity, paternity, parental leave, and what are the small, even the small ways that they support that type of lifestyle? So, an example is I went to a company here in Utah. I think it was Qualtrics, and I was I was pregnant at the time, and I think it was for some event. So I went there, drove over there, and I saw that their parking stalls, right when you get into, right when you come to the building, they have parking stalls dedicated to women who are expecting or pregnant women. And I thought that was pretty, I don't think I've ever seen that. I'm sure that's a common thing, maybe, I don't know, but I've never seen something like that. And that, all of a sudden, I don't know a ton about Qualtrics. We sometimes use it at Zions Bank, but I know we've used it at University of Utah. But that all of a sudden gave me this sort of appreciation for that brand and for that company. And if I was someone that was looking for a job, or younger that was looking for something that aligned with that, at that moment, they spoke to me and I would have applied. So little things like that, I think, mean something more so than the ping pong tables and all the other stuff that people don't really value.
Yeah, so it sounds like young talent is looking more for the company to care about them and invest in them as a person, as opposed to just an employee, which is definitely a good holistic approach. As you mentioned, and it's a shift from how things were done previously. So back to the idea or the fact that there's multiple generations in the workplace. There's baby boomers and Gen X, millennials. Are there any challenges that you've seen with this newer generation wanting these additional benefits and this additional approach of going after career and looking at their career? Any challenges faced between those groups?
Definitely. So I'll start out. There's an excellent study by Purdue Global that defines the 5 generations in the workforce right now and the different challenges, or actually the different way that they approach work. Each generation slightly differs. But when we come to work, we need to make sure that we're all connected, that we're aligned on the company vision, and that we know that there's a way for us to grow our careers, whether it's I'm, 65 and this is my 5th job, or I'm 25 and this is my 1st job. So, but for young professionals, I think one of the biggest issues or challenges is actually misconception, right? Where people say, oh, well, I read this in one article, and so this entire generation, because it's different than me or different than how I saw my family at work or my parents at work, they must be, and you hear words like entitled or unrealistic, things like that. And that's not the case. And so taking a moment to check our assumptions and dial that back and really have the conversation and that ongoing conversation about how do we connect? How are we all aligned to our company goals? And how am I, as a hiring manager, going to help you grow your career? and make sure that we are continuously talking about that.
I definitely agree. I think that there's a lot of trend reporting. There's so many articles and so much content around the differences between generations, and that's useful as much as it gives us language to understand these things, but it becomes really counterproductive when we stop seeing individuals and start seeing generations as, you know, entire demographics as just what we read in an article on LinkedIn. So I think that it's an important conversation to say, what are the trends, what are the patterns, but to meet every individual that you work with on a team or as a candidate as a person unto themselves, and ask them, like, what do you expect from me as a boss? What do you expect from me as a team member? And set really clear boundaries and kind of negotiate how you're going to work together. And you can get away from the assumptions. I think Becky highlighted some of the classic kind of accusations thrown at millennials, but I think it's also really important to remember that millennials and Gen Z groups come in with accusations and assumptions about other generations. There is way too much casual conversation around how older generations are stuck in their ways or not willing to learn technology. And that is completely ageist, completely counterproductive, and moves us away from that alignment with vision and goals that Becky was talking about. So again, looking at each other as individuals and remembering that everyone has assumptions and biases that they have to be actively checking, because we're all at risk for moving us away from that alignment if we're not intentionally moving toward it.
Yeah, Neelam, I bet you've seen this in your career as you've worked and focused on diversity. When we start to just make general assumptions, we immediately start othering entire groups, and that changes how we approach it.
Yeah, totally. The thing that comes to mind is microaggressions, like age-based microaggressions. Microaggressions are these subtle insults and slights that come up in everyday either conversations or actions. That are actually discriminatory, but they're just not as overt. But I think about age-based microaggressions, especially right now, as we all are working remotely and really utilizing technology to communicate and connect. I've seen it so many times where young folks are sort of are the microaggressors, I guess, in these spaces where they make these assumptions that, you know, older folks cannot use technology, or they'll make jokes and it's just not. It just kind of builds this toxic working environment. But then on the flip side, and I've seen this over and over, where, you know, the older generation look at younger folks as sort of, you know, incompetent or not experienced enough, and they get passed up by these great leadership roles because they are just not trusted to handle those leadership roles. But millennials specific, there's been studies around this where millennials specifically are great managers. They're great leaders. And if we're not developing that leadership, we're missing out. But because of those misconceptions Becky and Shannon brought up, we're just not fostering that leadership, and that's really unfortunate. So I love what Shannon was saying about the biases that creep in everyday conversations, especially across generations. And yeah, it happens quite a bit again, here I am at Zions Bank. It's an older organization with a lot of baby boomers, but also we're high in tech, and we have a lot of younger generation employees. And you do sometimes you see that clash based off of misconceptions. So I totally agree with Becky and Shannon.
So it seems like this is a commonplace, these microaggressions, these age-based biases. What do you see as a solution, or how do we get past this in the workplace?
So communication is often, and of course I'm expressing a bias right now, I've worked in communication for 15 years, but communication is often the problem in these situations, or a lack of communication, but it's also the solution. So, but when we think communication, we often think what I'm saying. It starts with listening, right? So whether it's an organization that is performing a quarterly pulse survey or engagement survey and asking these questions, it also starts with providing diversity and inclusion training that includes the many different aspects of diversity. You know, we often think of diversity as just a few items that make us different from each other, but Brene Myers has a wonderful book, 25 Habits of Culturally Effective People. What if I say the wrong thing, 25 Habits, but she breaks down a lot of different diversity characteristics. And often we haven't even started with that. So making sure that we have training that's part of onboarding, that this conversation is a two-way conversation, that we're listening, that the company as organizations, we're defining our long-term view, and that we have ongoing training as part of the conversation. I worked at a company where a global inclusion training was rolled out, and it was celebrated in many offices. In one office, it was interpreted as a punishment. Like, why would you have this training unless someone did something wrong? So it was excellent feedback for us to hear so that we could communicate the reason. This is part of an ongoing conversation, but really starting it early and continuing the conversation and defining why it's important to work together.
Yeah, I love early and often is my short answer for this. It is absolutely ageism and just generational identity is a component of any good conversation around diversity and inclusion. At Clearlink, on your first day of your new hire experience, I join every single new hire class and define what is inclusion and diversity at Clearlink, why it matters, and what the expectation is in terms of if you're here, these are the ground rules that we'll play by. I introduce the training that they'll receive. Just like Becky said, you have to explain it's not because we had a lawsuit or someone made a complaint. It was, we care about this, so we're going to give you the tools and the language from the very beginning. And then I think the other really important and powerful tool as it relates to communication is connecting these expectations to either company values or company vision. One of our company values is respect every person. And so it's a really easy way to tie it back to a common language that everyone feels connected to. And then you don't have to come at it as, I'm a Gen Z or I'm a millennial woman who's in these categories. I am a person who works at this organization and therefore I respect every person. So the more common ground through language and expectations you can give people, I think the better they are set up to succeed. And remembering that people almost always are trying their best. They just might not have the right tools or the right language to get there. So it's our job in these spaces to provide that toolkit and those expectations, and people will meet us there if we do that well.
100%. And to show them that there's an opportunity. I don't know, Neelam, you've probably heard this too, and Shannon, you too. As specifically in my role as head of diversity and inclusion, oftentimes I would have white male engineers come up to me and say, but what's my role? Do I belong in this conversation? And so making sure that our young professionals know that everyone has a role, you know, in that those values of respect, that everyone plays a role with the company values, and it's an important role.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add on that just basically what Shannon and Becky said. I can't argue those points. Those are really important points. But it is the responsibility of the company to build that culture and to tie in no tolerance expectations. And so when something is happening within an organization, if microaggression behaviors are happening, regardless of what the identity is towards underrepresented employees, it's a company's job to make sure that that culture has been built where there's just no tolerance for that. So it's either, as Shannon mentioned, principles or their values or whatever their mission is, it's incorporated into that, so that expectation is set up up front, but it's also remembered. The other thing I think is important is holding folks accountable. So when these things happen, what's the repercussion? And people disagree with me on this because they feel like we need to make room for mistakes. But how often do we leave room for mistakes and nothing changes? So I think it's really important that when a situation happens, that someone calls it out, that there's a culture of calling that out and correcting that behavior, or getting rid of that behavior, quite frankly. I think that is so important in today's society right now as we talk about social justice, specifically racial justice. So I think those things are just important to take. Companies need to take really hard stands on those issues.
And to Shannon's point, giving people the tools that Sarah Jones at Inclusion Pro has a wonderful training on this, where she talks about bystander. And if you're a bystander, you're less likely to call it out unless you know what to say. If you've been given tools in advance where it's, hey, I'm not okay with that. And in fact, the company's not okay with that. And giving people a few phrases that they know how to call it out, so that we freeze in the moment as people who are shocked, right? And so making that part of the beginning training as well, so that we can have the tools to call it out. Shannon?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think it's the tools, but I think with bystander intervention specifically, it's
Yes.
also the most fair or just way to deal with it, because for folks who are experiencing micro or macro aggressions in the workplace or anywhere else, they're already in a lower position of power and influence, and it's unfair to ask the group that's actively being harmed to respond with like kindness and gentleness to call out a behavior. Like, that's not a fair burden to put on a marginalized person. And if you're in the space seeing that happen, it is your job to respond to it. And it's our job in terms of organizational leaders to make sure that people have that understanding of that expectation and the language for how to intervene.
So Brandy, I know you probably have a question. I just have a question for Neelam and for Shannon. So what are some phrases? So in structure, we went through this, and one of the trainings we said, you know, the company's not okay with that. But I'm not okay with that. But what are some other helpful bystander intervention phrases that you've heard successfully used?
Things that I've heard that are helpful are, first, like, respond as quickly as possible. Like, the longer things go on, the harder it is to pinpoint the moment that was a problem. And from a framework perspective, it's usually more productive to connect with people one-on-one about it. So if there's a way, you know, we're virtual now, so if there's a way to drop a Slack or a chat to say like, hey, I really want to talk more about this thing that came up, to remove other people from it allows people to not be on the defensive in the conversation. And I think saying, this caught my attention, that's a good intro kind of phrase to bring up that there needs to be a conversation, but it doesn't immediately put people in a defensive space. And then my best method in terms of what I've seen in my organization, and all people are different, all organizations are different, but what I try to do is build some common ground and say, hey, I know that you care about being a good leader. I know that you care about being a good team member, and recognize like the human or the kind of the value aspect that I know that person cares about, and say, I know you care about being a good leader, so it really concerned me when I heard you using this kind of language, because it's out of alignment with the values of good leadership, with the values of our organization, and who I think you want to be as a leader and as a team member. So let's talk about that. In my experience, giving some sort of way to have people feel seen before providing a hard piece of feedback just makes them more receptive to it.
Yeah, that's great. I think along with that, it's also important to just ask questions. So when you said this, what did you mean? People typically they'll be taken back, or they'll just be like, oh, I must have messed up. Let me think through this, and allow them the time to actually think about it. But I also think that managers and leaders need to set the tone. So if these things are happening in a meeting space and a manager doesn't say anything, then you've already created a culture where no one's going to call it out. Right, and you're already letting things bypass. So there needs to be an extensive amount of training for managers and leaders to make sure that they know how to facilitate these types of conversations and normalize it, so that it doesn't feel like it's such a hard thing to do. When you're in that culture where people are open and they trust each other, they're able to give feedback that could be uncomfortable. Then you're able to move past these things, learn from them, and do better. So I do think that our leadership has a big, and it starts with CEOs, it starts with folks at the very top to set that tone that then trickles down to management and then trickles down to employees. And so it really is a whole cultural, again, it's just really building on the culture and making sure that culture fosters that type of conversation.
Thank you. I just have a quick question. So I have a different perspective. I'm on a really tiny startup company. So I'm just curious, is this training, is this commonplace, this bias training, this generational bias training in the ways of communicating? Is this commonplace, or is this something that is being developed and growing and spreading throughout companies?
I'll answer that. So part of my job is to develop training, and there's a few different ways to approach it. So just overall unconscious bias is a big training piece that covers all those different types of unconscious bias and how they show up and how they manifest. But even digging deeper to that, there are a lot of different types of training that talk about inclusive language across generations, that talk about stereotyping across different generations, but not just generations. So we're talking about intersectional identity. So, you know, people of color, people with disabilities, gender, all of that, LGBTQ. So it kind of is a holistic, I haven't seen a lot of trainings. I know there's a few people that are very skilled at training specifically on generational differences. And that's definitely out there, but I would say that as people are putting trainings together, they think about it holistically and what that looks like. So so to your question, yes, it's not as common, I think, but it's definitely incorporated into a larger training or educational awareness piece.
And I think while it's not uncommon and not necessarily common for companies that are at startup mode, we're starting to see a shift. And while 2020 has been a year of unexpected, terrible things, it's also been a year of monumental change, and building on movements that have been going on for decades and for hundreds of years, actually, especially here. I'm speaking from a US-centric viewpoint when thinking about racial equality. And so I hope, and I see more and more organizations that are prioritizing in this moment, prioritizing bias training, prioritizing workplace equity. And what's the difference between equity and equality? And how do we foster respect in careers in the workplace? So I hope that this continues, and I know it's on each of us as company leaders, and as we're hiring young talent and as we're helping people come into the workplace, normalizing this. So it's not a check this box and we'll be done. You know, you do this once at the beginning and that's it. No, this has to be something that is foundational and rooted in each organization.
It's also interesting to me because I work in this space, so I obviously think it's important and it's the right thing to do. But in terms of what we're seeing in trends from job seekers and from candidates, it is also increasingly the expectation. According to a Trend Hunters report last year, 77% of Gen Z candidates consider diversity a make or break factor in choosing an organization. So it's not just what we ought to be doing. If you're going to have a viable organization with the future workforce of the country, you have to be having these conversations and start learning how to approach it, or you're just simply not going to be able to hire talent.
Right? And I think as companies, action gets noticed. So even the smallest organization, you know, whether you're Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix, who made a $120 million donation to HBCUs, and, you know, in that moment, how many people were like, I wonder if Netflix is hiring, right? Or if you're a smaller organization, there's a company out here in Lehigh called Caris, and they do healthcare training, online healthcare certification and training. And their CEO made the decision to, instead of just increase internal training, they've started a scholarship for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So that, and it's not just, hey, this is for 2020 and we're done. This is now and moving forward. So the actions, this is a smaller company, not Netflix size at all. So no matter what size you are, your internal training matters, but also, and Neelam, to your point, what your CEOs are doing, that also will help attract and keep young talent at your organization.
I guess I could add to that. So Edelman, and just to Shannon and Becky's research, Edelman, a communications firm, released a trust barometer report where they talked about branding. So it's from a branding perspective, but they talked about how millennials and Gen Zs, 60% of them are going to stand and trust brands that have taken a stand against racial or I guess for racial justice. And that then transfers into, you know, as folks are looking for jobs, they're looking for companies that have flat out said that we are for racial justice, but not in a performative way. So there has to be some action behind it, whether it be some monetary, you know, whether it be ongoing donations or contributions or really working with communities. But I think that that's so important for companies to realize and recognize that there needs to be a very hard stand against racism. And it needs to be very public, but it also needs to have some action tied to it in order to attract talent today. Those are things that people value. It's a big 60%, is a huge percentage. 70, you're saying, Shannon, 70 plus percent of people are looking for organizations that are socially responsive. The other thing that is interesting that I found is that young people are not only looking for companies to take a stand, but they're also looking for companies to actually educate and create awareness. So you see like a company like Ben & Jerry's who has literally a whole page dedicated to racial inequity. And they talk about the disparities in America with Black and whites in terms of systemic racism. And they break it down on their website. I mean, you can Google it right now and you can see it. So for those who are new to the conversation, they can go to an ice cream, you know, company who literally makes ice cream to talk about racial injustice. That's crazy. There's not a full tie-in, but it's important that companies that have the platform to talk about and educate and create awareness around these issues. That's what's really important for our younger generation.
Yeah, you make a wonderful point as well about definitions and how many of us have walked into a room of fairly educated people on diversity and inclusion. And when you write diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging, you get 10 people in a room and you get 10 different definitions for each of those words. So even starting with education on what this means, especially if I'm going to work at the organization, I need to know how the organization is defining this and how we're working toward creating a better workplace together with every single employee involved.
Excellent. So I don't recall, maybe it was Shannon brought up that young talent is looking for diverse companies to come in. So we're all in Utah. It's not the most diverse, state. So how do you see companies in Utah bringing in more diverse talent? And what are the challenges that they're facing there and how are they handling that?
Shannon, why don't you take this one first?
Okay, I was gonna say,
way too much.
I manage recruiting, so I'm happy to touch on that. I think first and foremost, it has to be intentional. You don't get diverse candidates anywhere on accident because unfortunately, diverse candidates have to negotiate with, is this a safe place for me to be? These are questions that any person who's from a marginalized identity has had to wonder about spaces. And so if you are traditionally advertising, as in just LinkedIn, just Indeed, just Glassdoor, that's not enough to truly engage diverse candidates because a lot of that just doesn't really give those belonging cues or those safety cues. So you have to be intentional about how you're connecting with those groups. And you have to be really conscious about the steps in your process that might not even seem like they could have diversity impacts. So we use a software called Textio, which is a job description analysis platform, which will basically read a job description and tell you about, it will red flag words that might trend to giving you more male or more female candidates. It also has an ageism barometer, so it will let you know if this is going to overwhelmingly attract younger or older candidates. And what's really awesome about this tool is it recommends different words that just neutralize. And the great thing is you don't need to have one job description that's really male and one job description that's really female. When we move toward neutrality and inclusive language, all of our other key indicators go up. So we get more qualified applicants across genders, which I was only talking about binary gender, but obviously there's a spectrum there. You also get higher racial diversity, you get higher ability diversity. When you use phrases about accommodating disability, for example, both your number of alter ability candidates goes up, but your other marginalized groups go up as well, because they read that as a belonging cue that, oh, this is a workplace willing to make space and allow for me to belong as I am. And so you get other dimensions of diversity applying because of it. So something as simple as how you write your job description inherently influences your candidate pool. And then where you post those jobs really matter. And then how you assess your candidates. There can be inherent things on rubrics in terms of fit that are gendered, that are racialized, that are ableist, that are ageist. And so making sure that you have a diverse group of people as part of the hiring decision can't be done in a silo, that there is a structured way that we make hiring decisions, as in we're asking the same questions to all people, and that we're examining, when we say culture fit, what does that mean? Like, you have to, at Clearlink, we can't just say culture fit. We have to tie it to a specific value because that's our culture. But if you say culture fit and you already have an organization that's predominantly white, predominantly male, or whatever other aspect, you will reify exactly what you have. So getting really intentional about every single step in the process and saying, we don't just want to create a fair playing field, we want to intentionally bring in diverse talent because we know it's underrepresented in our organization, in our state, and we know we'll do better business and we will learn as individuals by bringing those people into our space. So it has to be intentional and constant, or if you're not doing it intentionally, you're going to do it in a way that is subconsciously racist, sexist, ableist, ageist.
100%. So you mentioned Textio. There are a few more that I always like to have people check out. There's Tap Recruit and WittyWorks. So if organizations aren't running their job descriptions through one of those three, or there are others, but if you start searching Textio, Tap Recruit, WittyWorks, you'll start to get more online tools to help you and help your job descriptions. And I think that one other thing is not letting, and this maybe is where bystander intervention comes in, but when a hiring manager says, well, Utah just isn't diverse, and then all of a sudden it's just no longer even a priority because it's too hard here. It's not, right? So what we need to do is making sure that I run this training where we talk about all of our different chambers of commerce, whether it's Utah Black Chamber, Utah Hispanic Chamber, Latinos in Action, several different Polynesian chambers and groups. The list goes on and on. Once you start to take a moment and do research as a hiring manager, as an HR team, and make this part of the training, that we no longer say Utah isn't diverse. Granted, we're not as diverse as other states, but if we are intentional with our connections, we will see a change in diverse hiring.
And measure it. That's the thing I forgot to say. Like, we should be measuring these things and reporting out on it. If we're not measuring it, we don't understand it and we aren't prioritizing it. So if you say Utah's just not diverse, but you have no idea what percentage of your applicant pool is of whatever dimension of diversity, then you don't know what you're talking about. So you have to be tracking that information, prioritizing that information, and then turning to your recruiting team and saying, hey, maybe Utah isn't as diverse as other places. Where can we be posting jobs to engage with diverse candidates because we care about that? Like, that is a fair ask to make of a talent team. And if you don't know how to get there, talk to your talent team, make it an expectation. If you want recommendations on chambers, like Becky has some, I know some great diversity recruiting organizations. It's not hard if you're willing to put in the work.
Yeah, I agree with everything. It's interesting because I always feel like, and I've said this many times, but I feel like it's a cop-out when people say that there's a pipeline issue. No, there's not a pipeline issue. 1 out of every 4 Utahns is a person of color today. If we're just thinking about Utah locally, our Hispanic Latinx community is growing. It's one of the fastest growing communities in Utah. Our LGBTQ community is so robust. we are, you know, 50% of our workforce are females. So to me, it's just kind of like, I mean, it seems that way, right? Because we're not compared to, you know, Los Angeles or New York. But I think we have, in our own right, we are very diverse. And yes, we need to, as a state, work on recruiting and attracting more diverse candidates throughout the nation. We have some work to do. I'm not going to excuse that. Also, our Black population is very low. And so we need to figure out culturally, what are we doing to retain Black talent that are coming in, that are transplants. But other than those pieces, the talent's there. So all the mechanisms that Shannon and Becky proposed are great mechanisms to make sure that you're tapping into that talent. The other thing that I was thinking about as we were talking, and one thing that I think has been hard, I don't think anybody's figured it out, but if you go through the process of recruitment, you change your application and your job descriptions, you build relationships with local community members, you have great recruitment tools and platforms that you're registered to. So you bring folks in, and let's say that's no longer a problem. What happens when that person then reaches their hiring manager, and the hiring manager looks at you and says, nah, based off of their own biases, and then they let you go. So it's interesting because there's a lot of great tools around recruiting and making sure that there's inclusive recruiting happening. But then it stops at the gatekeepers. And these gatekeepers are folks that are just not trained enough, well trained enough to recognize their biases. There was a study at UCLA and several other higher educational institutions that did studies, and I'm sure you all have heard of this. I always go back to it because it just shows how pervasive bias is. But they did a study where they released resumes that are identical to each other out to different organizations. But the only difference were the names. And so the resumes that had white sounding names or male sounding names had 50% more callbacks than women sounding names and ethnic sounding names. Like that stops at the manager or the hiring manager space, right? And so I think we could put in a lot of great, robust systems to make sure that we're mitigating bias, but then it kind of, I guess, just blows up when it reaches the hiring manager. And so I feel like there needs to be some concerted effort in that space to make sure that we're hiring the right folks to be our leaders in that space. And I think that's where the problem, that's where we get really stuck, is just right there. So that's sort of my
I think we have to have multiple people talking about what's happening with a rec to prevent that. So with my team, we meet weekly with our HR business partners to review every open job, how many people have we interviewed, what are the roadblocks, and we have had to call out. I'm noticing a trend of like, I don't think that a manager's doing it on purpose, but I'm seeing a preference for a certain gender, a certain age category. We should examine this because it's a pattern, and I want you as my HR business partner to back me up and say, how do we like address this with a hiring manager to ensure that it doesn't get stopped at that potential bottleneck? You have to have people, one person can't be the gatekeeper, like you said, Neelam. It can't be one person who makes that decision, and there has to be people with both language but also influence, enough power to call out when there are problems.
Yeah, it starts and ends with communication. It's the problem and the solution, and being able to address it by having those processes in place. And then also one challenge that I give when I would give diversity and inclusion training for something that every single person in the room, hiring managers, people who are starting day one on their job, is examine our own networks. Often jobs are filled not just because the company was looking, but because a friend of an employee was told about a job. So if our networks look predominantly, and study after study show, my network will look predominantly like me. So a lot of white women that came up together in PR around the same time. And you have to intentionally look at that and cultivate a network that is more inclusive. And that's how Brandy and I met. And I was so happy that we connected and we talked about this opportunity, and but to be able to be more inclusive with all of our networks, and to be able to learn from people of different ages, to mentor those who are just young professionals who are just coming in, to learn from people of different genders, of different orientations, and of different ethnicities. It's super important. And it's something that every single person could do today. Take a look at your social networks and see how you can expand.
Awesome. We're running low on time, but I really feel as though it's important to touch on the Black Lives Matter movement and how companies are responding to that. And the role, we touched on the fact that it's felt that companies should put out a strong statement to help bring in young professionals and help them feel comfortable. However, some companies feel that they don't want to put out a statement because they don't want to alienate other people. They feel as though it's a political statement. They don't want to say anything at all. How do we feel about that in context of this discussion?
I'll go super fast. So take a long-term view, not just while this is a moment for where attention is drawn, take a long-term view of what the values are of your company. And they should, gosh, I hope that every single company aligns with human rights and equal rights and civil rights. So take a long-term view, communicate. This shouldn't be one and done. And communicate what you have done and what you will do, and make sure that you're aligned. Again, that connection, that alignment, and that growth as an organization with how are we supporting and ensuring that we're bringing more equity to the workplace? How does Black Lives Matter align with our brand as well? And what can we be doing both internally and externally, not performatively, but actually to make meaningful change, make and support meaningful change?
Yeah. At my organization, we didn't do an external statement because we're a B2B company. No one knows that they buy from Clearlink. So in terms of a brand, it didn't matter how consumers reacted to this, but there is a massive amount of pressure and expectation internally. I'm really grateful that we had an executive team that had so much clarity on what our values were and what our commitments were, that it was a difficult moment because it's in response to needless murder of people. So of course there's inherent difficulty there, but it wasn't hard for our organization to say, here's where we stand. We already had these values in our DNA. We had partnered with the Black Chamber of Commerce 6 months before this had happened. So we'd already started to think about what's our connection and how do we create equity with this particular group in our community. But we've also had other elements of diversity for the long game, like Becky touched on. We've been part of Pride since 2015, thinking about what your organization has done in action, even if they don't have the language for it, and connecting that to say, oh, this is who we are. And then I think it's really important to say that it's not inherently political to say that Black Lives Matter. That's a human rights standpoint. That is recognizing people's personhood. And I refuse to have people's personhood and the debate of whether or not people deserve to live be tied to party identity. I think it's reductive and it's not productive. And I just refuse that that's a party issue.
Ooh, I got a couple seconds. So here's what I'm going to say to this. I'm going to echo everything that Becky and Shannon said, and just Shannon's last bit. That I feel like companies are ill-informed if they don't align with Black Lives Matter movement, and that most of it is based off misconceptions. Some folks are reading off of the Black Lives Matter website and coming up with their own conclusions without really understanding what they stand for. Black Lives Matter movement is a call to action to really eradicate and really break down the systems that are violently and racist and anti-Black and violent in nature towards our Black community. It's so important that we call that out. I don't see why any company would not align with that. But with that said, I think that if you're going to make a statement, it's got to be authentic. And so don't just make a statement that just because everybody else is doing it, don't just plaster your logo towards the Black Lives Matter movement just because everybody else is doing it. Unless you have anything to back it up with action, don't do it. And recognize that maybe your company has a ways to go to do that. So just those two dichotomies, I guess.
Any last statements anyone would like to make?
if you feel overwhelmed as a company leader, just start small and get clear on what the definitions are, get clear on what your company values are, start small and continue to make iterative steps to improve your company culture and improve how you're growing young talent's careers and helping to move diversity forward.
Yeah, similarly, I would say something's better than nothing. Remember that this is an evolving space. You'll make a mistake as an individual and as an organization. I really love Brene Brown has a sentence that I try to remember. I'm not here to get it, or I'm not here to be right. I'm here to get it right. So focus on what the goal is and take ego and the personalization out of it, and you'll move toward the right things with that.
I think for two sides, so the companies and the organizations and the business that are working to attract talent really truly understand what the values are that folks are holding and try to align with those values. But similarly, on the other side, folks who are looking for jobs, make sure that those jobs align with your values and make sure you're very clear what those values are. If they don't align, you're not going to be happy.
Awesome. Thank you, ladies, so much for joining me today and having this important discussion. And I'll see you guys later. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandy.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Brandy. Thank you,
Thanks
Becky and Shannon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.